So I was fortunate to be one of Saul Katz's fellows. He was the godfather of the pulmonary department here at Georgetown. He graduated from Georgetown Medical School, did his residency at Gallinger, and was the chief at DC General, and then chief of medicine at the VA before coming here. He was an incredible, brilliant man who inspired many, many people to go into the field. Even at towards the end of his life, he knew everything there was to know about pulmonary medicine. He really shaped me and formed me into what I am today. Education was paramount to him, and it's from that I've modeled my career. So this is the Saul Katz Memorial Award. And today we're going to have Dr. Nate Cobb, who will be our speaker. Nate came to us at Georgetown in 2009 as he's an assistant professor. He's also the vice chair of bioinformatics. He did his undergrad at Georgetown University before going up to Boston at Boston University for his MD degree. He then did his medicine residency at Beth Israel Deaconess. After his residency, he spent a year maybe working as an attending at the Martha Vineyard. The Martha Vineyard's hospital, that must have been exciting, before becoming a fellow in pulmonary and critical care at a BI, Brigham and Mass General. He has since then done a significant amount of research. He's been co-investigators on R01. He came to us as also doing a lot of research that's been funded on how they, using social media. His main targets of the research have been smoking cessation and vaping. And he also was a research investigator at the Schroeder Institute. And he was the chief medical officer for the MIU Health in Boston before coming down to us at Georgetown. So it's with those thoughts that I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Nate Cobb, who's going to talk to us about vaping-induced lung injury, e-cigarettes, and the federal regulation, and the 2019 epidemic. Thank you, Nate.
Thanks, Chip. That was a very generous introduction. I'm excited to be here and hoping that this all goes smoothly. So this is, in addition to being the Saul Katz lecture, it's also the inaugural attempt to present grand rounds via Zoom. So I'm going to hold questions until the end and then ask that you send them, I think, to Ernest Fisher via chat. But in the meantime, if something does go wrong, contact him or me if we're having issues or I cut out or something like that. Otherwise, I will continue to talk and never know. So in terms of financial relationships, I have no relevant financial relationships that I'm aware of, nor am I aware of any of those for my employer, which would be MedStar. So this might be a slightly unusual talk. Despite the topic of acute lung injury, there's going to be no mouse models. I don't think I'm going to use the word cytokine once. There will hopefully be no long list of minor studies in which I just so happen to be an author. This is really a talk about public health. It's a talk about a surge and epidemic of cases of acute lung injury and how that intersected with the medical system and with the public health system. And I think in many ways where we fell down. When I initially put this talk together, the first version of it back in 2019 at the end of the year, this seemed like a big deal. Thousands of cases, a whole number of people dead in ICUs. And then obviously the epidemic got superseded by the pandemic. But I think there are lessons in this story that help us think about the COVID response and perhaps help us think through a little bit of where we also could have done better in our response to COVID and where our public health system does well and doesn't do well. I'm going to tell it sort of as a story. And this is in part because as I was putting the first set of slides together, my daughter found Harry Potter. She's 7, and over the course of a couple of weeks, pretty much read all of the books. And if you've read them or your kids have read them, you know that they start and they're very clear who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. It's pretty stark, but by the end, it becomes a little less clear who's good and who's bad and exactly what's going on. I think this story is a little bit like that. We often seek to figure out things in a very binary way. and sometimes it doesn't quite play out that way. So before I get into it, I think a little bit of the historical trend in tobacco is important. From sort of the 1960s, when we first really realized that the tobacco was a major driver of morbidity and mortality in combusted tobacco users, we saw a pretty great drop in adult combusted tobacco use up until about 2000. This was driven primarily through messaging, through the media, through education of physicians as well as patients, but ultimately also through the development of pharmaceutical therapies, through ancillary therapies such as telephone counseling, training physicians on how to do counseling. And it seemed going into sort of 2000 that we were on target to eventually make tobacco something, combusted tobacco something of the past. But then in 2000 and sort of through 2010, everything plateaued. And it was a period of a lot of frustration for those of us in tobacco control. We couldn't figure out where we'd gone wrong. We were firing on all cylinders. We'd come out of major funding increases. We had great drugs relatively for what we were doing, but we were absolutely stalled. And then something happened around 2010 and the numbers started to drop again. And through 2010 through about now, rates have gone in adults of combusted tobacco use, gone from about 20% down to something around 15%. And there's a lot of discussion about exactly why this is, and nobody's quite sure. But it's been paralleled by similar drops in youth, with drops in combusted tobacco use in high schoolers in use, somewhere up towards 20% back in the 90s, down to the low single digits today. And if you sort of think about what the causes of this is, one of the potential causes has been the increase in e-cigarette use. E-cigarettes first came on the market in perhaps 2006, 2007 in the US, although they've changed a lot. But significantly, when you sort of play this out, you would expect to see really increasing use in adults, but that's not quite what we see. We see use in adults pretty much similar to the use of nicotine replacement, very low levels. But in high school students, it's surged. So that by 2018, maybe 1 in 5 high school students reported using recent e-cigarettes. So on one hand, we've started to do very well in driving combusted tobacco down. On the other hand, it's not clear why, and use of e-cigarettes has at least been increasing in youth. So that sets the background for what we're going to talk about. So what is an e-cigarette? So it's hard to talk about these things without really understanding what one is. And part of the problem is that there is no regulatory definition, right? If a manufacturer of an e-cigarette says it's an e-cigarette, it's an e-cigarette, even if it's actually a ham sandwich. It doesn't matter. There's nobody in the federal government that requires it to look or act or contain certain things. It really is, it's whatever somebody says it is. That said, there's some general constructs that sort of we generally assume that these devices will have and do. This is an image from a paper that I published years ago when e-cigarettes were fairly new, and they were what we would call cigalikes. So they were designed to look like another sort of a regular combusted cigarette. And what had happened at this time was I had a grad student working with me, and he showed up in my office one day with an e-cigarette, actually a couple of them, and he said, "Hey, Dr. Cobb, have you ever seen one of these?" And I was junior faculty at the time, and I'd been very well trained up in Boston, and I knew exactly what you said in a case like this, which was you lie, and you say, absolutely. I said, absolutely, Justin. Why don't you tell me what you know? And so Justin proceeded to educate me. And walked through what at this time these devices were, which is fairly simple: a tube about the size of a cigarette, a little larger usually, with a battery. Battery's connected to a switch, and the switch is a trigger. Usually it's either a flow or pressure sensor. Sometimes it would actually be a little button that you could press. That's connected to a heating element. So when the switch throws, the battery connects to the heating element heats up. That is next to some sort of wick, which is then next to a reservoir of a fluid containing nicotine. So the heating element heats up the wick, the fluid gets hot, and depending upon the type of fluid, it creates a vapor. Most of these devices, continuing through today, use propylene glycol as their humectant, or the containing fluid. And propylene glycol, in addition to being a constituent in a lot of our drugs, we use it in IV drugs as a carrier. It's used in cosmetics. It's widely accepted as safe. It's in foodstuffs, but it also is used as theatrical fog. So when it is heated, it creates sort of very nice puffs of very visible sort of smoke vapor. So an individual would inhale the same vapor through the e-cigarette and then exhale, and it gives you sort of this nice cloud. The initial versions of these devices all have little LED lights at the end. So when you inhale, the battery switched through, it would sort of look like it even was heating up and had a lit tip. And at the same time, my group, working with folks over at Lombardi, decided that we would pull these apart. And so Justin and I literally pulled apart a bunch of these devices and sent off fluid samples from 2 of the major device manufacturers off for chemical analysis. And just as we were getting ready to publish this, we got scooped by a blog post from the FDA, which is sort of it was a formal analysis, but an informal publication. So we wound up including their data in our paper as well. And we were mostly interested in, at that point, how much nicotine was in these devices, as well as any evidence of contaminants. And so at that time, these devices claimed that a cartridge contained about 16 to 18 milligrams of nicotine. And what we found was, when we tested them, the concentrations were much lower, 3 to 4. The FDA found sort of 5 to 7 maybe. And this is not a lot of nicotine. A pack of cigarettes usually has about 20 milligrams. A single cigarette has about 1 milligram available nicotine. So this is not a lot of nicotine. And it starts to look more like the amount of nicotine that you might find in nicotine replacement. And it's simply not enough for most people at that time to be worried about, and suggested that most of these products were going to be fairly poor in delivering nicotine, right, which is the addictive part of a cigarette. But what the FDA found that we did not find was evidence of contamination. And this didn't get a lot of media attention, didn't get a lot of scientific attention, but it was quite worrisome. And they found diethylene glycol in one of the samples that they tested. Diethylene glycol is similar in some ways to propylene glycol. It is not a byproduct, or doesn't occur in the manufacturing process. It's completely different. But it's a feared contaminant of products made with propylene glycol, because occasionally manufacturers, particularly in foreign countries, will inadvertently substitute one for the other. Diethylene glycol, unlike propylene glycol, is actually highly toxic and will cause renal failure with fairly low doses. This has occurred overseas in Haiti and other countries when it's been inadvertently put in toothpaste, cough syrup, and it happened years ago when it was a contaminant, or it was actually the carrier in an antibiotic syrup, which was distributed widely in the US years ago. So this was pretty concerning, that while there wasn't very much nicotine in these early devices, that there was a potential for contamination. Over time, these devices fairly quickly changed, and by sort of 2011, maybe, we started to see what were called tank mods, or tank e-cigarettes. And these are the ones on the left here, or at least on my left, which are these sort of much fatter devices to enable them to have a much larger battery, but also a larger reservoir of this sort of low concentration nicotine. And it also abandoned the idea that they would look like cigarettes, right? We've called them e-cigarettes, but now we've abandoned the idea that there is really any similarity. They do not have combusted tobacco. They don't heat up tobacco. They contain refined nicotine, propylene glycol, and they no longer look like a cigarette. These eventually gave way to what are often called the cartridge, or the pod type, similar to Juul, which became much more sleeker as their batteries became more efficient and concentrations went up, allowing the manufacturers to create these sort of much more efficient devices, but also moving to a model where the manufacturer sells the device, perhaps not making very much money on the device itself, but makes money on the cartridges, which are then flavored. So similar to the way you might buy a printer, where the printer is inexpensive, but the cartridges for the printer are where they make their profit. Over the years, there's been a lot of discussion at conferences, in papers, huge arguments in papers, back and forth. I've been involved in many of these about the potential toxicity of e-cigarettes. And I'm not sure how well this gets represented ultimately for those of us who are physicians or even in the media. But at the end of the day, risk is always a continuum. And the question is, where do e-cigarettes sit on the risk continuum? At the far right in this conceptualization, we have combusted tobacco, which is one of the most toxic products that is on the market or has ever been on the market for consumers, right? So the inhalation of combusted tobacco filled with a number, hundreds of different highly toxic products, which causes an endless array of cancers as well as emphysema. The risk from this combusted tobacco drops fairly quickly as you go from cigarettes down to pipes, cigars, and water pipes, but stays fairly elevated and highly significant, but drops again as you go into the products that are designed to be absorbed through the oral mucosa, such as, which we generally call smokeless tobacco, such as snus, spit tobacco, and all of those. And then on the far left, you have the pharmaceutical products, such as the patch, the gum, or even the inhaler, which is rarely used. E-cigarettes have a series of chemical components, again, mostly propylene glycol as well as flavors and the nicotine, that would tend to, at least in terms of their components, put them on the nicotine replacement side. When these are heated, there are certain off products that are not present in the nicotine replacement products that may have certain risks that probably push them somewhere into the smokeless tobacco risk continuum. But again, this is orders of magnitude less than the combusted tobacco. So as we think of them, we should probably think of the risk as somewhere between a high risk pharmaceutical product or a lower risk drug or consumer product that our patients certainly should not be using and we should educate them on. And this matters in part because when we talk about risk, consumers and patients have very different ideas than I think what we do in the medical field. So if anybody has ever talked to a patient about sort of aspirin and Plavix and bleeding risk and gotten the response, but this is safe, doc, right? No, it's not safe. There's a high bleeding risk. And many of the things we do aren't safe, but they are on a risk continuum with a risk-benefit ratio. When you talk about consumer products, for the most part, we don't think of it that way, right? High chairs for kids are supposed to be completely safe. And if there's a risk of falls, they come off the market. In fact, virtually everything in the United States has a sort of a risk continuum like this, but a regulation that prevents risky products from being sold. This is sort of the token picture of my dog, who is now about a year old, but was a small puppy during the E epidemic. And he got into his dog food one day, not into his bowl, but into the bag. And in that bag, he ate as much as he could. And then he ate some more. And then I think he ate some more. And so when we found him lying on his side, his belly was about the size of the rest of him and just all kibble. And so I took him into a local animal hospital, which by the way, if you want to see a model of efficient billing, take your dog into an animal hospital, where he had to have an IV and stay overnight because apparently all of that dry kibble in his belly puts a dog like this at risk of dehydration and ultimately renal failure. So he got the 4-star treatment at the local animal hospital. But the point of this is that we normally think of something like pet food to be completely safe unless left open for a 3-month-old Labrador Retriever. And this is because the FDA regulates pet food, which is something that many of us would never think about, right? But they regulate how it's produced, what it contains, how it's marketed even. All manufacturers have to have a food safety plan. They can't put anything in it unless the FDA has it on the list of substances that are generally recognized as safe. And if they want to put anything else in it, they have to write a formal petition to the FDA. So this is how not just our regular foodstuffs, but across pretty much consumer products, food, drug, we keep things safe in the United States. And this is what consumers, whether they are familiar with the system or not, generally expect. When we talk about the regulation of e-cigarettes, that's different. In the United States, we have fairly limited regulation compared to, say, Europe. In Europe, there is a limited set of ingredients that e-cigarettes can contain. There's a strict definition of what an e-cigarette is. They cap the amount of nicotine that you can actually put into it. So it's capped at 20 milligrams. Now, you remember our initial data suggested that most of the initial devices had maybe around 5 or 6 milligrams. So here we are already talking about significantly more. absolute prohibitions in Europe on youth sales. In the US, we also prohibit youth sale, although as anybody who has a kid knows, the wide distribution of Juul suggests we're not very good about it. There's no cap on nicotine concentrations. Manufacturers have to disclose, they have to send their ingredients into the FDA, but there is no way for consumers to find out what those ingredients are. There's only recent limits on flavorings and so on. So there's fairly limited regulations in terms of what safety would be. The FDA has announced repeatedly and then postponed a set of regulations that would dramatically change all of this and likely put many small manufacturers out of the business. But not surprisingly, these have been delayed and certainly will not happen under at least this 4-year presidential term. And we'll have to wait to see what happens in the next presidential term. What I've been talking about is where my sort of public health colleagues and researchers have been focused on for decades, and that is nicotine products, primarily combusted, but then also e-cigarettes. And this is the lens through which $1 billion worth of research and public health infrastructure sees these devices through nicotine, through their name, the semantics of e-cigarette. But the reality is that not all of these devices are for nicotine, because they are, at their simplest, a drug delivery device paired with a drug. And this shot is of marijuana devices that deliver THC oil. So THC oil is extracted from marijuana and then loaded into a cartridge. And as you see, these are very similar to sort of the tank models for nicotine. But you can also get a whole array of different ones, including some very small, sort of almost pen-like models and so on. These are available on the black market. They're available in district dispensaries here where marijuana is medically legal. But the reality is that while we think of sort of a single monolithic federal regulatory structure for nicotine, under which e-cigarettes perhaps are not regulated, that there is no such thing for marijuana. And so these devices, when loaded with marijuana, are all over the place, literally all over the map. In some places, they're completely illegal. They're always illegal at the federal level, but sometimes legal at the state level. For example, here in DC, medical marijuana is legal. In California, marijuana at the state level is completely legal. However, that still doesn't quite get to regulation. So California, unlike many other states where it is legal, has a fairly good regulatory structure. For example, producers of marijuana, all the way from the grower to the sale, are required to track the marijuana so that if something goes wrong, it can be tracked back to the initial grower and then pulled from the supply chain. But these regulations add a burden, which is seen as, which ultimately results as a higher cost. So even in California, the black market for marijuana products is estimated to be about twice as big as it is as the legal market. And so these marijuana THC containing e-cigarettes sort of fit, and they go back and forth between both the regulated and the unregulated black markets. Going back to nicotine cigarettes, so over the past several years, we've seen a quite significant spike in their use. And when you talk to folks, a lot of this is attributed to Juul, which I think is fair. Juul became a billion-dollar company off of the backs of selling to kids, often mail order, but also in stores. But the magnitude of this, and seen numerically, is often stark and surprising. So between 2017 and 2019, it was estimated that the 12th graders went from a prevalence rate of vaping nicotine from about 11% all the way up to 25%. This is often chalked up, again, to Juul and to marketing and flavors. But I think we do ourselves a disservice when we look at it that simply. If you go back in time again to about 2010, when we looked at the nicotine-containing e-cigarettes, this is a group that basically had folks come into a lab, put an IV in them, and then sampled their serum nicotine levels. And the high levels here is individuals smoking traditional, just puffing on their own branded cigarette. And the black arrows at the bottom are when they were told to puff. And then so the top line there is the big spike and then slow drift down over the next 40 minutes of nicotine levels when using combusted tobacco. And this is the pattern that you see in an addictive drug. It's the very fast, spiky delivery of the nicotine directly into the arterial system to the brain, which causes the reinforcement and then ultimately the behavior. At the bottom was asking them to do the same thing with a couple of e-cigarettes that they provided them. And the conclusion here is that there was basically, similar to what we thought, very little delivery of nicotine. The same group very quickly pivoted and said, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would people use these devices if that were true? Brought a few people back into the lab and instead said, hey, just puff on these devices like you do at home. Not the way we told you to, like a cigarette, a real cigarette, but just do whatever you do. And so it turns out that back in those days, people puffed on these fairly continuously. Users used them over minutes or even hours, which is why ultimately those larger tank mods had to evolve to have much larger batteries and larger reservoirs so that they could get the delivery over time. And over 30 to 40 minutes, many users could actually get up to a steady state approximating that of a real combusted cigarette. But this was not sort of from a business sense where any of these manufacturers wanted to be. And about the same time, there was a group out of Duke that realized that by creating what's called a nicotine salt, by bonding nicotine to pyruvate, they could change this. And they could create a nicotine form that had a much better palatability, but also much better uptake. And that when a device was loaded with this nicotine pyruvate, you started to see this very similar high spiky delivery, giving you much higher plasma levels. This nicotine pyruvate data from early 2010 shows maybe about half of the peak levels that you would see in a regular combusted cigarette, but these are significant because they're wildly different in sort of the potential for reinforcement of what we had seen previously in the earlier models. Not surprisingly, a small number of manufacturers adopted this. Most of them appeared to be afraid of what the FDA would do if they went down this road, as there were a small number of people who were sort of warning against this. But Juul jumped in enthusiastically. They use a different salt than pyruvate, but it has allowed them to juice their nicotine content from, remember, initial numbers that we saw, maybe 5, 7, or 8 milligrams per milliliter, to the European limits, which are 20 milligrams per milliliter, to what was estimated in 2019 in toxicology analysis to be as high as 56 milligrams per milliliter. So not just much more highly concentrated, but also having that same delivery pattern that you saw for the nicotine pyruvate. And I would suggest that we focused on the wrong thing with Juul. It's not their marketing, it's not the flavorings, it's not all of this. It's that they've built a better mousetrap, one that is much higher in addictive potential, and that kids simply love for that reason. And that's the reason that they didn't have any of their market share eroded by similar devices that were also had good flavorings or good sort of easily pocketable, because they perhaps did not have the real, very strong nicotine delivery that Juul managed to achieve. So because I'm playing here and I'm using the tropes of a story, I'm going to give you all a little diversion and go back in time to 1937. And this was before the modern FDA existed. In 1937, also, we didn't have a lot in the way of antibiotics. Sulfanilamide was one of them, and a company called Massengill was looking for a way to convert what was the pill form of this into something that was a syrup and would be more easier for kids to take. So they had one of their chemists devise a syrup, created a carrier, used a carrier sort of off the shelf to dissolve the antibiotic in it, and this was marketed extensively across the United States. Unfortunately, very quickly, people started to die of renal failure. And the federal government, what was then the early precursor of the FDA, scrambled. And in what was essentially a tour de force of public health investigation, within weeks had traced back this syrup to the manufacturer, figured out what had gone into it, and then pulled it entirely from the supply chain. And remember, this is before we have the internet and all of these other things that allow us to do this quickly. But ultimately, over 100 people were estimated to die. Now, the chemical that this chemist used was diethylene glycol, the one that I mentioned earlier that the FDA found in the early e-cigarette samples. And one of the reasons why this was so both ironic and scary. In 1937, we also saw the birth of the modern FDA with the initial Food and Drug Act, which created the modern FDA to make sure that massengill would never again happen, that we would have a regulatory structure that would make manufacturers stick to things in their food, drug, and other products that were understood to be safe, and keep people from sort of freelancing and just creating any product off the shelf that might be highly toxic. So now fast forwarding all the way to the summer of 2019 and the beginning of what we saw ultimately as the E Valley epidemic. And here what I'm actually going to do is sort of tell this story using the CDC's words and the words of the investigators that worked with the CDC and published mostly in the New England Journal. Most of this happened fairly quickly over a period of about 3 to 4 months, and was fascinating to see unfold, but in retrospect perhaps appears a little differently. So on August 21st, the CDC put out a release notifying physicians primarily, public health folks, of more than 149 possible cases of severe lung illness associated with e-cigarette product use. This was across 15 states, beginning in late June through August 20th. And they did note that while this was primarily about e-cigarettes understood to be nicotine e-cigarettes, that a significant number of these folks did report using THC. Very quickly after this, this was followed with a better description, which was published in the New England Journal. And at this point, we got a better idea of what we were looking at. So as of August 27, we're describing this as severe pulmonary disease associated with e-cigarettes. This gave us our first look at essentially what it looked like in terms of the pathophysiology process. And so what we understood very early on was that the bulk of these people had infiltrates, usually at both bases, basilar, mostly sort of a ground glass process, but often verging into a full consolidation. This was described in the early case studies with an array of different acronyms as being similar to a whole bunch of different pulmonary diseases. But at the end of the day, for the most part, sort of ground glass to consolidation of both bases. The folks in these initial series had fairly consistent set of symptoms. They all had respiratory symptoms, mostly a cough, shortness of breath, hypoxia. Many of them presented with some early findings that were systemic, fever, chills, some fatigue, often some gastrointestinal, little nausea, diarrhea. And the vast majority of these folks at this point were hospitalized. This helped the CDC at this point give us a case definition, which was used throughout the epidemic. So it was very simple. Any use of an e-cigarette in the last 90 days, so going back fairly, that's 3 months, any use over 3 months, infiltrates on the chest film or CT scan. They needed to have had a full workup with no evidence of pulmonary infection, and they needed to not have any alternative plausible diagnosis, for example, CHF or so on. So fairly wide open definition. By mid-September, we started again to see rising numbers. So 53 cases, 1 death at this point. And started to get a much better idea of who this was. So 83% were male, most were young. Respiratory complaints were universal. The constitutional were almost universal as well, and GI was common. The vast majority were hospitalized, and about a third wound up in the ICU. And these numbers you'll see are fairly persistent throughout the course of the epidemic. But again, a good chunk, more than half, significantly more than half, reported using some sort of THC as well. Now, again, as I mentioned, in public health and tobacco control, almost all of e-cigarettes are seen again through the lens of nicotine and combusted tobacco. And we've been looking for ways to convince folks that e-cigarettes are probably not a good idea, right? Again, on the risk continuum, they're not combusted, but they're probably not a place you want to be on any sort of risk continuum. And they're certainly a bad idea for kids. So this was seen as primarily an opportunity for messaging to get people to quit. And New York, at about this time, moved to ban all flavored e-cigarettes, which the public health community had been moving for very aggressively over the past decade since they emerged. And the governor at this point actually issued a unilateral ban on all flavored e-cigarettes, which pretty much took e-cigarettes for the most part off the market in New York, except for the black market and internet sales. By late October, this was a full-fledged epidemic with over 1,600 cases, 39 deaths. Again, the vast majority remained male, the majority are young, and hospitalizations at this point is fairly universal, with 30% winding in the ICU. THC use remains again in the 80s, although many people don't report any THC use, which is somewhat confusing. And we have a much better clinical idea of what this is. So again, respiratory symptoms, cough, dyspnea, chest pain. At this point, we understand that it can be somewhat insidious, developing over a period of weeks often. All of the patients require hospitalization to the point that the CDC redefines its case definition and no longer takes case reports of people that are not hospitalized. A third of them progress to intubation. Most of these people who do require intubation progress in a fairly fulminant way. They don't sort of linger like we see with our COVID patients and get intubated a week later. They were fairly coming in and getting intubated in the ER. And the abnormal imaging sort of turned out to be fairly consistent with ground glass and consolidations. And through the course of this, and to today, recommended therapy really has been supportive. And because pulmonary critical care docs provided the bulk of the care, virtually all of them got steroids because that's sort of what we do. So, but none of this tells us what actually happened, right? And so to date, there hasn't been a lot written on it. And I think this is one of the most interesting things. So when I teach data science to medical students and to residents, one of the things I emphasize is that, if you have a question and that question you can't answer in the literature, there's a reasonable question that you might be able to answer it with a publicly available data set. There's a lot of good stuff out there. And so in the middle of this epidemic, there were 2 papers published reanalyzing existing large-scale data set surveys that nobody had looked at in this way. And they went back and they looked at marijuana vaping, which was a question in these 2 surveys. One of them was the Monitoring the Future survey, which, if I remember correctly, is the one here. And they went back and they looked at the same time period that I showed you earlier for the increase in nicotine use, primarily attributed to Juul. What they found was that in 12th graders, marijuana vaping had skyrocketed between 2017 and 2019, concurrent with nicotine use. It had gone from about 5% to 14%. I didn't know this, and I don't think anybody really understood the magnitude, right? So not only were 12th graders starting to use Juul and nicotine, but they had started to also adopt and vape marijuana at the same time. By November 15th, we started to get a much better idea of what was going on. So by November 15th, a group working in conjunction with the CDC published in the MMWR and then quickly afterwards in the New England Journal, the results of a series of BALs, bronchoalveolar washes, in intubated patients in medical ICUs. And what they found was that in 29 of their BAL samples, they found vitamin E acetate. Vitamin E acetate is not something that you would theoretically find in any sort of BAL result. It's not a chemical that we normally look for as a toxin. And it's certainly not something that's ever been noticed before in the academic community in e-cigarettes. But because at this point we had so little idea what was going on, the CDC was able to support sort of a very broad collection of possible toxicology in their analyses. Interestingly enough, they didn't find nicotine in all of these samples, but true to form, not everybody for whom a history was available reported using THC. So a lot of confusion at this point, except for this was the first thing we found that made any sense, that potentially there was a toxin in some of these devices. We started to get a better idea of what might be going on when Minnesota published some data in the MMWR as well. And what they did was very simple. They went back and they had stored samples of illicit THC products that had been confiscated in 2018, as well as the stuff that had been confiscated in 2019. And they analyzed a subset of both of these. And what they found was that in 2018, there was no vitamin E acetate in any of their illicit e-cigarette samples, marijuana in this case. But in 2019, it was widespread. So this suggested that vitamin E acetate was something that had entered the market and entered the supply chain in 2019 and potentially concurrent with the E Valley epidemic. Now, ultimately, this was published later. The same group, when they had a full series of 51 patients, found vitamin E acetate in 48 of the 51 lung lavages. And these are insane numbers, right? A BAL is not a terribly sensitive test. To be able to detect a substance like this in 94% of samples was a really big deal. And whether or not the other 6% were truly E Valley patients, or whether or not the test was simply not sensitive enough, I don't know. But this is about as conclusive as you get, and was ultimately the smoking gun that suggested that what had happened was that somehow vitamin E acetate, or another chemical we didn't determine as a co-traveler, was the culprit for lung injury. Because all of these talks need a mouse model, this is the mouse model. Later, after much of this played out, a group was able to take mice, expose half of them to vitamin E, half of them to polyethylene glycol for 2 weeks, then sacrificed them and bronchhed them and did autopsies on their lungs, and found out in the vitamin E acetate patients, alveolar macrophages and pneumocytes had abundant oil, red O-stain lipids consistent with the vitamin E toxicology. So this is very suggestive, again, not only of vitamin E acetate as a potential culprit, but also as a potential mechanism. So what is vitamin E acetate, and how does this happen, right? This was odd, and again, not suspected. This sort of came out of nowhere. So vitamin E acetate is a chemical. It's fairly widespread. You can buy it on Amazon in big jugs if you want. Usually comes out of sort of China or so on. It's basically a grease. It vaporizes at a temperature of about 360 degrees. It's used in skin creams and other sort of cosmetic products normally. But it also potentially has another use. And this is a shot of THC oil. And one of the things that happens, particularly in illicit drug markets, is that there are really only a couple of ways to make more money with your product. One of them is to somehow get a better price for what you have. The other is to somehow make what you have more. So most drugs have been subject to cutting, diluting them with some substance. This happens with cocaine. This happens with bulk marijuana, virtually anything. With THC oil, what they do is they then mix in some other kind of oil and often some sort of coloring to make it, to bulk it up so that they can sell that at the same price, but selling a higher volume. And the way this is detected by people in the supply chain is what's called the bubble test, where you take a sample of the THC oil and you rapidly flip it. And that bubble that is at the top should not flip as you flip the tube. It should stay in place and reside at the bottom. And if it does flip, it tells you that the viscosity of the THC oil is low and it's likely been cut. So people who were doing this, who were cutting, needed a chemical, again, to increase the viscosity of the cut THC oil. And in California, there appeared a product called Honeycut. Honeycut is a thickening agent designed for THC oils and sold explicitly in their marketing materials as a compound to thicken or to eliminate bubble movement and leakage. Now, you've probably figured out what it is. It's vitamin E acetate. And similar to the chemist, when we talked about Massengill, who sort of pulled a chemical off the shelf with the assumption that it might be safe, but no knowledge, the folks who did this, in all likelihood, had no knowledge of what it would mean to inhale or heat up inhaled and vaporized vitamin E acetate, but nonetheless sold it into the supply chain. As all of this was sort of being discussed, a commercial company out of California that works with the marijuana industry testing marijuana as part of compliance, decided to go back and test their supplies. So what they did was they tested everything they had on hand, which is the blue dots for vitamin E. So they are part of the regulated market and found that their regulated samples contain no vitamin E. But when they went out to the illicit market in California, remember representing perhaps two-thirds of the total market, they found that virtually all of the samples of THC oil which they pulled out of the illicit market contained vitamin E. Again, suggesting that not only is this something that was introduced in 2019 that was not there before, but it's something that was primarily from the illicit market, not from regulated markets. So interestingly enough, this comes on very quickly. So by December 6th, we've had over 2,000 cases, 48 deaths. It's occurred in all 50 states, including the district, although we did not have a case here at Georgetown. It's got an overall mortality rate of 2%, right? It sounds somewhat familiar, right? It's higher than COVID. Median patient age is 24, 67% are male. And interestingly enough, the big spike in deaths occurred in September, about when the first attention came. The red arrow here is the first reports of it through the CDC. And then almost as quickly as it came, it's gone, right? By December, there are no more cases reported. By sort of January, the CDC has stopped taking case reports and stopped publishing anything on this. Now, the real question is why, right? And you might think, as you look at this graph, and if you are in tobacco control, you might think of this in a number of ways. And one of them is the classic behavior change, which is what, for the most part, the tobacco control and the public health communities pursued through this entire process. A strategy of communicating across all age groups, across all cohorts, that e-cigarettes were dangerous and that you should stop, that if you were using, you should stop immediately. So that is one possibility. But that's not the only possibility, not the only model. So in this certain model of behavior change, we try and get people to change what they do. But in another model, we try and change things in a way where we say, perhaps the problem is actually with the supply chain. So similar to Massengill, again, working very quickly, very backwards to determine if there's something in these products that should be pulled out. And I would suggest to you that what happened here in reality was that in sometime over the summer, the folks in the illicit marijuana industry realized what was happening. And in retrospect, there was a lot of chatter in sort of email communications, in public bulletin boards, and even within the online marketing sort of journal, online journal that a lot of them use called Leafly, and concern about honeycut and vitamin E. And so one way of thinking this is that behavior changed. And then all of these young men that we struggled to convince to wear helmets or condoms suddenly stopped vaping, both highly addictive nicotine as well as THC. The other is that the vitamin E acetate washed out of the supply chain as fast as it came, as people immediately started to dump all of their supplies and replace them with clean supplies that no longer had vitamin E. That model is similar to what we might think of in epidemiology, John Snow and cholera taking the handle off the pump. But again, it's also the exact same model that occurred with Massengill and the development of today's FDA, and this idea that both we attempt to prevent the contamination of these products, but also we quickly work back when it occurs to change the supply chain, to change the product to make it safe again. And it might end there, right? And I hope that it did, and I hope that this isn't something that we see again. But reasonably, it will probably come back. And this is my last slide. Shortly after we stopped seeing cases, a small group published a small paper, which most people probably didn't read, but I thought was fascinating. And they said, hey, we're not seeing this in THC oil anymore, but CBD oil is pretty similar. What's going on there? So they went out and they found a small manufacturer that was selling CBD oil. So CBD oil is similar to THC oil, except for it's considered to be inert, not to have any psychoactive properties. and is sold without regulation universally. It generally comes from hemp rather than marijuana. And so what this group found was that, yes, it was contaminated. And not surprisingly, it was contaminated with things that looked deliberate: synthetic THC, cough suppressant for reasons that escape me, and melatonin. Pardon me. So it's difficult to say with any clarity that without changes in regulation around e-cigarettes, that this isn't going to continue to happen. These remain highly addictive drug delivery devices when used for nicotine. They're sold throughout the country in nicotine supply chains and through both regulated and unregulated marijuana supply chains, and basically still continue to provide a potential for widespread poisoning and contamination. So I think it's worth all of us sort of keeping this in mind, continuing when we see people with acute lung injury to wonder what they've done, what they've ingested, if they've been using different forms of inhaled either marijuana or nicotine, and really doing a thorough history to get to any potential toxicology exposures. And with that, I think we have a few minutes left for questions, if anybody has any.
Well, thank you for that grand talk, and covered a lot of important topics. I think Dr. Fisher is fielding questions at this point. I guess put them on through the chat room to Dr. Fisher, and he'll pass them on. Why do you suppose, Nate, with that all these products keep coming? I mean, they're not regulated is, I guess, the answer. That each of these products keep coming out contaminated with one thing after the other.
Yeah, you know, I think it's hard for us to look, both as physicians, but also in a highly regulated world, at this, and we often forget that these are folks with profit motive, and that sounds terrible. Another way of saying it, these are folks with families to feed. And when you're looking for a way to make a little bit more money or for a little bit more security, you may reach for something that, if there is no rule against it, you might try it. And I think that's, you know, while the folks that ran Honeycut, which apparently was maybe 1 or 2 people, did something terrible and probably killed a bunch of people, they were working in an environment where they probably didn't see anything wrong with the chemical. They certainly knew that the sort of the process of cutting and then thickening was unethical. But, you know, I think a lot of this is just sort of this, I'm going to give something a shot because nobody's told me not to. The reality is that large companies like Juul, for all of their stems and for, you know, what they have done, the product that they make is highly predictable. The nicotine is very similar to the stuff that goes into nicotine replacement, the pharmaceutical supply chain. It's a terrible product, but it's highly consistent and, quote, safe within the boundaries of what it's supposed to do.
There was, I don't know if you remember this, back in the early 90s, there was this sleeping product that was related to tryptophan that they were marketing in all of like the GME stores, and all of a sudden they started identifying these people coming down with eosinophilic myalgia syndrome. Never had it before, and it was from this, there was only 4 or 5 companies that made the tryptophan, but only 1 for human consumption in Japan, and they changed the processing. It was a contaminant that got into the processing that led to this.
Yeah, you know, years ago I used to say that, you know, that cigarettes were the only unregulated product, and then we have e-cigarettes. But the reality is we also developed sort of what are called nutraceuticals, which is this entire array of essentially chemicals and drugs, which are sold as nutritional products and thus unregulated, like tryptophan, but are designed to do something, right? Melatonin we use as a drug, right? We use it in sleep. It acts as a drug. It affects the physiology of the body, but it's sold, you know, in stores which sell nutrition products. Tryptophan similarly, CBD oils similarly. So there is sort of these sort of pop-off valves for regulation that exist in the United States, and real potential for contamination and harm.
We have a couple of questions. We may not get to all of them, but there's ones that are related. So the first part of it would be about what is the way, you know, obviously not smoking e-cigarettes is the best, but what is the safest way people can do it? And then if there is a safe way, is there a role for it in tobacco cessation?
A role for e-cigarettes?
For e-cigarettes, yep.
Yeah, so this is controversial, and I think there are a couple of things. So if a patient comes into you who's using e-cigarettes in lieu of combusted, right, that is great, right? I don't see any way to see it except for a win. If somebody has given up combusted, we've made progress. I generally start with an attempt to get them off of the unreliable nicotine in an e-cigarette onto something else, onto a pharmaceutical product. But it's important to remember that in reality, it's often easier to get the e-cigarettes, and they are often cheaper, right? Unless they can get nicotine replacement paid for through their insurer, which they are supposed to be able to do, but insurers can be painful. For folks that really don't want to do that and are sort of say, I'm already on doing this, this is working, I generally try and get them to cut down and generally suggest that they buy from an American manufacturer through a reputable supply chain. So this is one of the few times I'll say sort of like, at least we know Juul is producing a reliable product that's not contaminated. And then work with them over time. For people who have not started, who are looking for a way to quit, I don't generally recommend e-cigarettes for the simple reason that I don't think they add any value over the nicotine replacement that's available in the pharmaceutical products. I and a lot of people are more aggressive, particularly I think we've been taught with this whole process of e-cigarettes that people need more nicotine. So I generally start with the nicotine patch plus the nicotine gum, even at higher doses, so 21 milligram patch, and then the 22, the 2 milligram gum ad lib, right? So keep the patch on so that you don't get you don't go into withdrawal, and then when you have an urge or craving, just grab some gum. Again, some people are still gonna wanna use the e-cigarette, but again, an e-cigarette, if used for cessation, and particularly if the person can wean them off, is going to be significantly less risky and a better morbidity and mortality profile than continuing combusted tobacco.
Are there any reliable THC or cannabinoid manufacturers?
That's a good question. So, you know, I think it's very difficult to say yes. The reality is that I think that one slide I showed that showed the vitamin E acetate not present in any of the commercial samples which were sent to this lab in California is helpful. And had that lab said, by the way, we saw 2 samples this year that came through our testing that had this, and we sent them back and we told them, that would have been scary, but they didn't see any. So I think for the most part, while I would still have concerns about THC oil being sold anywhere, if you're buying, for example, in DC through a dispensary who is then buying through a more regulated channel, it's likely going to be safe because their supply chain is going to be better. Whether or not you can say that inhaled marijuana or combusted marijuana is then safer than THC oil, I wouldn't be comfortable with that statement. I think they have their own risks.